Bienvenidos a Alimentos y Emociones Podcast. Comer es inevitable. ¿Cómo comer para saciar mi apetito? Es una elección. Soy Claudia Unot. Acompáñame a hablar sobre temas de conducta alimentaria, de la relación emocional que tenemos con los alimentos y cómo satisfacer uno de los impulsos más fundamentales que tenemos en nuestra vida, nuestro apetito.
Today I have the pleasure of welcoming Susan Carnell to Alimentos y Emociones podcast. Susan received her BA in experimental psychology from the University of Oxford, and her PhD is in health psychology at University College London, and she completed postdoctoral training at University College London and Columbia University. She is currently Associate Professor in the Division of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, where she heads the Appetite Lab. A central question motivating her research is, why do some people develop obesity while others don't? Her research program investigates the model that individuals differ in appetite-related bio-behavioural traits, example, food cue responsiveness or satiety sensitivity or responsiveness, that manifest early in life, show genetic influence, and interact with environmental factors to predict eating behaviours and weight trajectories. To probe this model, she employs a range of methods including behavioral tests, questionnaires, genotyping, hormonal assays, and neuroimaging techniques such as fMRI, MRI, and PET. Ongoing research projects include investigations of appetite and body weight in infants, children, adolescents, and adults, including studies of bariatric surgery and eating disorders. So we welcome her to Alimentos y Emociones podcast. Hello, everybody. It's really nice to be back here on Alimentos y Emociones podcast. I'm very excited today and quite honored to have Susan Carnell with us today. Hello, Susan. How are you?
Hello.
So good to have you here today. It's
lovely to speak to you. I'm looking forward to it.
We're going to talk about, how to measure appetitive traits in general and appetitive traits in general as well, because we've just been sort of talking about the slight confusions there are. But I just want to start the conversation by sort of saying, how on earth did you get onto this subject when you started, in your career, in your early career?
I love these origin stories. Yes, I mean, but common to many other people, I'm sure. It was a complete accident. So I did my first degree in experimental psychology, and in my final year, I did a research project, and I just kind of fell in love with research, and it happened to be on a kind of health project. And I saw lots of people doing PhDs around me, and I thought, well, that looks fun. You just get to do research for a bit longer. And I had originally, I was very interested in the effect of music on emotion and the effect of exercise on your mood, and these kinds of topics. And then my supervisor at the time said, well, how about eating behaviour? Because Jane Wardle is in University College London and she has research funding, which of course is a very important aspect of your career. And I thought, well, why not? And so I applied to her, and that's how I kind of got into the whole eating behaviour game. And then, the first project she had me do was just a lit search. And so I dove into all the literature, which was a lot easier back then because there wasn't very much around. So I came across the work of Leanne Birch and other people who studied parent feeding and had all these behavioural tests of children's eating behaviour, and kind of got into it that way. First started being interested about parent feeding, and then getting interested in genetic influences and how children were influencing their parents' behaviours. And then more recently, I've got into more the biological side, and I'm doing the neuroimaging research. So that's the very kind of long-winded way to say it was a complete accident, a happy accident.
No, actually, that was a short-winded way to say it was a nice. So when you started working with Jane, what did you start off with, say?
Well, as I said, the first thing was this lit search, really trying to kind of learn about children's eating behavior. And I kind of zeroed in pretty soon on parent feeding, because there was this big theory out there that if you over control children's eating, you might have these paradoxical effects and make them become kind of more attracted to the restricted foods, or you might disrupt their own internal ability to regulate their intake by pushing them to eat beyond their satiety. And so my first project was actually just a cross-sectional survey looking at the relationship between parent feeding and children's eating, as I know you've kind of discussed in your previous episodes. And the data from that project and from many of the other studies coming out at the time just looked much more like we were seeing a phenomenon of parents responding to their children's eating behavior traits. So that is what got me set down the path of exploring children's eating behavior a bit more and looking into the genetic influences. So that was actually the first project, was a cross-sectional survey in children in London.
And the parents. But was that already kind of like using CBQ? Yeah, that was kind of like...
Well, yeah, no, that's a good question. So that first project was actually looking at weight. So it was just looking at the relationship between parent feeding and weight, and showing that the only really strong association we were seeing was between higher pressure to eat in parents and lower weight in children. And that's what got us very interested in looking at these influences perhaps flowing in the other direction. So we actually also did some qualitative work where I interviewed a lot of parents and found that definitely from their perspective, they perceived themselves as responding, making this kind of adaptive response to their children's eating. And so those were actually some of the kind of earliest studies that... And
that was at the time that the CBQ was already existed, and then you started using as well the CBQ to measure the traits against the sort of parental influences.
That's right. So the kind of next step then, so the children's eating behavior questionnaire had already been kind of developed by Jane, but then we wanted to kind of pull that out and actually validate it. So, the CBQ is a parent report measure. And as we as parents know, there can be issues of bias. So parents may not necessarily be the most accurate informants on their children's behavior. They definitely have an advantage because they see their children behaving over lots of different situations. They know their children very well, but there could be bias in any direction. So they could be wanting to portray a kind of more positive image of their children's eating behavior, perhaps particularly if they have particular opinions or desires for their own eating behavior, for example. Or it could even, work in the other direction. Maybe they see the world a bit more negatively, and that could kind of come out too. And of course, it's just hard to make judgments about kids' behaviors as well, and to kind of average and give an accurate reflection, especially if you were doing it retrospectively, for example.
Yeah.
So what we wanted to do was to see whether whether measures of children's eating behavior in objective real life actually corresponded to the scores that parents were giving them on the child eating behavior questionnaire, because then we knew we could use the child eating behavior questionnaire to ask all these other sorts of questions that we were interested in.
So the laboratory wasn't actually kind of like a foreign object to you. The actual going and measuring what children ate, it wasn't foreign, because you'd already had kind of that previous experience from your sort of pre-grad or graduate studies, or am I?
Yeah, well, that was my first, my PhD project was actually a kind of eating behavior project. So it was actually, when I look back on it, I'm kind of amazed that we pulled this off. But we basically went into preschools for 5 different days, and we gave children a lunch meal on every day. It was actually presented in what's called a party Susan, which is was a nice kind of twist of fate. So we presented them with, fruits and vegetables and sandwiches and all this stuff. We did that on 5 different days, piled all the trays in the back of a car with Lucy Cook, who was also a researcher there at the time, trogged around to all these schools in London on 5 different days. So we had that measure of kind of ad libitum meal intake on 5 days. And then we did an eating in the absence of hunger test on another day. So this is a kind of paradigmatic measure of children's eating behavior that some people may be familiar with, where you actually get children to eat to satiety, and then you see what happens when you present them with some more palatable foods. So do they kind of eat beyond what their kind of homeostatic satiety would determine? So we kind of did one of those tests. We had these kind of 5 meal tests. And we also did what's called a test of caloric compensation. So this, again, is a test that's been around for a while in the field. And the idea of it is that it assesses children's ability to regulate their own intake based on their previous intake. So we actually did 2 different versions of this test. I'm going to just go right in for the details here.
Yeah, no, please.
Understand the way that we kind of obsess about these different measures. So for a caloric compensation test, you use what's called a preloading paradigm. And the version of it we had the children eat lunch on 2 separate days, but they had a preload drink beforehand. But we varied the calories in the preload drink. So one of them was relatively high in calories and one was relatively low in calories. And we actually did this in a very sneaky way because we used something called maltodextrin, which you can kind of, a carbohydrate, which you can kind of slip in to create extra caloric load, but it's actually undetectable.
Yeah.
So the children didn't know necessarily that they were consuming more calories. This was just an orange drink. And then if a child shows a kind of regulated response, which might correspond to something like satiety responsiveness, as measured on the Child Eating Behaviour Questionnaire, then you would expect them to eat relatively less after the high calorie preload than after the low calorie preload. So we kind of were able to behaviourally test children's ability to regulate intake using that paradigm. We actually did 2 versions of that paradigm. And then what we were able to see when we compared all that data that we collected with the CBQ scores is that we could explain it was about 56% of the variance in the satiety responsiveness score with all these behavioural tests. So that was showing us that this kind of measure that was just parent report was actually reflecting how children behaved in real life. And not even in the presence of their parents when they were in schools in a kind of quite naturalistic environment that they were used to eating in. So that was the study which made us feel confident to kind of go ahead and pursue our kind of research ideas using the CBQ.
Yeah, which is excellent because then at least, that is like the go-to paper, which I'll sort of, it just in case anyone hasn't read it, I will sort of, put below in the link. And that way people can go to, because that really is the paper that sort of shows, no, we're not just measuring questionnaires. And yes, this is a measure of validation that shows that the CBQ does work, and does measure what it says it measures. Now you're more involved in kind of all sorts of other measures as well. And how has that work gone for you? Or maybe I think I might be jumping too far ahead, because there's a little gap in between there, which would be, then of course you use the CBQ and everything to collect all the data from the Gemini, work. And that was the genetic link that you might have been referring to earlier.
Yes, no, that's right. Well, actually, even before Gemini, I had the chance to work on the twins' early development study. Which Claire and Ali have also been involved with. So this was kind of a pre-existing cohort study. Those children are definitely not children anymore. So they've been followed for a very long time.
They're about 25 or something, 25, 26, something like that, I think.
They just get older and older.
We don't.
Exactly, we're stuck. Yeah, absolutely. But that was one of the first studies we worked on in which we were able to show that variation in both kind of enjoyment of food as captured by the CBQ and satiety responsiveness as captured by the CBQ were actually substantially genetically influenced. And it was also in that cohort where we were able to do one of the first studies showing that variants on FTO, which is a gene which has been associated with common kind of obesity in the population, also was having some of its effects on weight via satiety responsiveness as captured by the CBQ. So that was actually work that I did sort of towards the end of my PhD and a postdoc fellowship I had with Jane. And that is what got me really interested in the biological part, sort of how are you doing this to people's behavior.
And so that took you where, like after you did your postdoc, where did that take you?
Yes, well, that kind of interest and also a desire to just have a bit of an adventure, to do a postdoc in New York. I'd be lying if I said it was all research. It was kind of 50% research goals and 50% life goals. So I went to do a postdoc with a mentor in New York who actually was very interested in appetite hormones and the influence of kind of ghrelin and PYY and GLP-1 on people's eating behavior. So I kind of jumped into that project, and he was starting to get interested at the time in neuroimaging. Yeah. And so, of course, I was immediately thinking, how can I apply this to the questions I'm interested in? Yeah. And how can we use neuroimaging to tell us about what the biological basis of these appetitive traits is?
So basically, that's taken you onto a kind of like another set of validations, if you like, because you have found like these associations with. Can you sort of like tell us about that a bit more?
Yeah, I would. I'd love to. I mean, the first, well, maybe I'll start with kind of what we're currently doing. So this has been presented at conferences, but the paper is not published yet. But what we did in our most recent study was to use a neuroimaging paradigm where we actually show people pictures of food in the scanner. So this is sort of the closest you can get in the scanner to kind of emulating what a person's brain might be doing when they're exposed to food in the world, which triggers them to eat it, which of course is the very essence of what we're trying to get at with appetitive traits. Yep. Measurement of appetitive traits. So what we found when we kind of administered this paradigm in a sample of adolescents was actually that adolescents who score higher on things like food responsiveness and actually also on enjoyment of food and emotional overeating are actually activating reward centers in the brain to a greater degree when they're exposed to these food cues. So it's kind of a step along the way of showing what is happening on a biological level and showing that these really are bio-behavioural traits.
Yeah. That's brilliant. What about like more homeostatic pathways? Do you see those sort of images or not?
Yes.
If it's more reward pathways, then you're thinking more sort of like on the hedonic side, no? And sort of thinking, hang on a second, maybe that's more environmentally driven, or what's going on there? That's
a great question. Yeah, I mean, the sort of hedonic and homeostatic circuits are, of course, very interlinked. Mm-hmm. I mean, we found in that study, for example, we've looked at the relationship between satiety responsiveness and the difference in brain response in a fed and a fasted condition, which is sort of trying to get at this idea of how your hedonic circuit activation changes in response to your homeostatic signals.
Yeah.
And then we do see that individuals who are kind of higher in satiety responsiveness, actually measured by caloric compensation in this example, are actually activating kind of homeostatic centers in the brain more in the fed condition relative to the fasted condition. Right. So that's kind of one example. We've also got some very interesting work going on looking at the hypothalamus. So that's kind of the kind of most understood homeostatic region of the brain. Yeah. It's actually quite difficult to see in neuroimaging because it's very small, but you can sort of more work coming out trying to target down. That.
Yeah,
absolutely. And what we're doing right now is a study where we're actually able to measure inflammation in the hypothalamus and show that that's actually greater in kids with obesity. And of course, what we're interested to know is, how malleable is this, and is it actually one of the factors which might be influencing kind of eating behavior and perhaps maintaining obesity that way. So that's kind of what we're doing to look at the homeostatic pathways as well. But I think it is very interesting because they are, in close communication.
Yeah. Well, I don't think you could, necessarily separate them, but what drives what, and when. I'd like to sort of maybe take you along maybe another sort of path and that we touched on before we started taping, which is this concept of how do you see sort of appetitive traits now? I get a lot of, oh, well, you study appetitive traits and that just has to do with, this area, questionnaire area, and that's it. But I think that actually appetitive traits are questionnaires or appetitive traits are bigger than the questionnaires. So what would we be talking about? And, how this area has grown and,
Yes.
I think that's an interesting one to unpick right now. Maybe maybe you could help with that.
Yeah, I'd love to. I like to spend my time thinking about this. Yeah, I mean, I think really what we're trying to posit is that there is this kind of underlying construct, like you might, pick apart in a structural equation model. So there's this underlying construct, and then we could measure it behaviorally with some of the tests we've talked about, and they might give you kind of a snapshot of behavior. And then we could manipulate behavior and see, how people respond to a challenge. And that's kind of one way of getting at what this underlying trait is. And then we've got parent report, which has its problems, but maybe kind of averaging across a bunch of situations. And so I think for, the goal really, or to know that we're studying a thing, we would want to have that kind of cross validation. And if all this evidence is kind of pointing towards the same kind of thing, then maybe we are looking at a construct. But I think, yes, it's interesting because I think really what the questionnaire approach is just it's kind of taking a psychometric, psychological approach to the problem that other people have, and there are other valid approaches to take to the problem. So I think a lot of it is, it kind of emerged from Jane's background as a psychologist. And of course, we have great measures of anxiety and depression, and why not also have one of appetite? So I think that probably could seem quite strange to someone who is purely an experimentalist. I think it's also the difference between whether you want to show something about a population or differences in a population. Or
where you're just going to measure individual cases, because I'm sure you don't have the same sort of sample numbers using neuroimaging that you would use, if you would think of like just the Gemini study or TEDS or whatever, you're not going to have access to that many people,
Right, exactly. You kind of need, you need both, and they're sort of answering different questions. And for example, a lot of the experiments are sort of designed to say, well, look, this is what happens. Well, you give kids this certain food, and then as a group, they kind of regulate in this kind of way. Whereas the kind of psychometric approach comes more from looking at what might be the individual differences. So I think originally those fields sort of arose a bit separately, and then of course all the creative, interesting stuff happens in science when you try and kind of mush them together, as we're all trying to do. And that's how things are moving forward. So I hope we can all talk to each other nicely as lab people and, questionnaire people, and then people who like to do both.
Yeah, I think so. I really like that thought. It hasn't happened to me yet here, but I think it's starting to anyway, but I like that thought. And I also like to think of like the appetitive traits as not just these 8 described by the CBQ. So restraint is also an appetitive trident. There's elements of this genetics as well, but or this disinhibition. They have been measured other appetitive traits, so that's something to think about as well. And maybe
it's so important. And then
maybe you've done all that, like more work as well now in adults and in different stages of the life course, measuring sort of other traits, being unfaithful to the CBQ.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, no. I mean, I think one of the nice things or the unique things about the CBQ and the ABQ, as opposed to some of the other ones, which of course have been around for a very long time. So there's the Dutch Eating Behaviour Questionnaire, the 3-factor Eating Behaviour Questionnaire, spurned by work happening in the 60s and the 70s, looking at kind of individual differences in eating behaviour. So obviously there are kind of other measures. I think the CBQ and ABQ are a little bit unique in that they try and get at satiety responsiveness. So actually a kind of measure of fullness, which people might do on a state level, but haven't really done so much on a trait level. Whereas I think there's other questionnaires that do measure things like restraint and disinhibition. They much more came from a kind of eating disorders disorders field.
Yeah.
Of course, there are others, in the field who would argue that many of these questionnaires are, of course, trying to get at the same thing, which I think we would agree with. But I still think, there is kind of nuance and differentiation and kind of appropriateness as well clinically for different populations. For example, the food addiction questionnaire or the power of food questionnaire might work better in a clinical population, whereas our questionnaires are really more designed to kind of capture variation in the whole population and perhaps even at the lower end.
Or what do you think about using them clinically as well? Because, I use them clinically, yes, in the development of the ATI, which is the appetitive trait tailored intervention sort of thing, by, giving them a score. So what do you score on? And then you give behavioral, recommendations to what, to just modify their eating behaviorally because they have the presence of this trait, and it's very specific because it's tailored to each and everyone's individual trait. So they're not just for use in population. I think that there's a lot of work to be done in all the stages of the life course to use the questionnaires.
I totally agree. No, I think that's really why we've been doing all this work. Obviously, there's lots of interesting basic kind of mechanisms we want to understand, and there could be lots of kind of offshoots from that, but I think that's absolutely essential work to find out how they can be kind of useful clinically. And Kerry Boutel, I don't know if you've mentioned her work. She's obviously very interested in trying to tailor kind of obesity treatment for kind of kids, for adults with binge eating, but she's been very inspired by these ideas and whether she might be able to actually help people advance towards a more precision medicine approach for obesity treatment using these questionnaires. So I think I'm
going to try and see if I can get her on the podcast. I'd really love to be able to talk to her about it. And yes, the other thing I was going to say is, like, with all your neuroimaging and assays and stuff like that, how do you see that working clinically as well to help?
Okay, I'm so excited about this because we have a paper that we're just revising. We haven't got to revise and resubmit about actually just trying to explore how people see the role of the brain in obesity. Because I'm wondering if we could be kind of getting to a point where we might be able to give people, feedback on what their brain response to food is, for example, and whether that might be kind of integrated into some of these the types of interventions that you're kind of exploring or that Kerry is exploring. I don't think maybe we would just kind of we're probably not at the state of the science where we would just be able to show someone a brain scan and that would tell us everything we need to know. But I'm interested in whether we might be able to integrate that information into a more behavioral based feedback to kind of supplement and demonstrate that these are kind of biological traits to some degree. And then, of course, we need to explore whether this is going to help or hinder, because if people see kind of brain feedback as more like genetic feedback, we know that we can't assume that giving people genetic feedback is going to lead to improvements in health behaviors. It could lead to fatalism, for example. So I think these are just kind of wide open research areas that we need to explore.
I'm heavily into sort of all the, brain scans and sort of mental health and women's health and reproductive health as well, just as a side reading. And I just think that this too, when I think of like all the work that you're doing, I find that just really interesting as well. It's difficult because, it's not accessible to everybody. And I guess I have this sort of population health outlook, like Jane, in the sense that the questionnaires are so easy to use, whereas the scans are a bit more difficult to get your hands on.
That's right. But like you say, it's a sort of validation. So maybe that gives the kind of behavioral work more weight if we can show what it means, what these things are representing.
So that's the work that you're doing now. And, anything else you've got in tow or that you've explored that maybe you'd like to just unpick a bit here, and then we might close off? even though I feel like I would like to carry on talking to you forever and ever.
Yes, we'll set up another few hours of private Zoom.
Yes.
Well, I would love to kind of mention the new study that we're kind of really excited about at the moment. So we've got this infant longitudinal study called Resonance. So it's kind of our attempt to do something like Gemini, but with neuroimaging. So we have appetite measures, parent feeding measures. It's actually part of a much broader initiative that's across the US, but the focus of our specific project is neuroimaging. So I do think we still don't know enough about how appetite changes over time, the development of appetite, how, people's trajectories diverge. There's still not that many kind of longitudinal studies out there, and then none which have looked at brain development. So I'm really interested in seeing how appetitive traits are represented in the brain and how early patterns of early brain development correspond to appetitive traits. So we're doing lots of work with that cohort now, which is pretty exciting.
And how old is the cohort, or when did you start measuring them, or what's going on there?
Questions. Yeah. I mean, we have kids in the cohort from 0 to 12. And there's actually also a sub cohort of prenatal moms. So we'll have kind of
cool.
In appetitive trait questionnaire language, we've got BBQs, CBQs, CBQT, CBQs. It's accelerated longitudinal, which means it's not that we just kind of got everyone in infancy and we've got as far as 12. Some kids are starting a bit later. Kind of piecing all the data together.
So you've got sort of different stages. It did not. So it's not like Gemini that they were all born in 2007.
Exactly. Yeah. So I'm very excited to kind of, use that sample to probe the biological basis of appetitive traits. Obviously, everything was being collected during the COVID pandemic as well. So we're very interested in seeing how the kind of pandemic measures have affected kind of eating behavior and obesity, and in parallel, brain development and the neural systems which kind of support the development of these traits. So that's probably the thing we're most excited about and working on hardest at the moment.
That's a lot of work, actually. So good luck with that.
Thank you.
I don't know if there's anything else you'd like to mention, because, like I said, I could sit here for a long time, but I think this is like just really good nuggets of information that give us then people can find you if they want to or are interested, and read the work that you've done as well. So I will put links below and everything.
Sure. Yeah, that would be great. I'd be happy to chat to people more. And we did publish a review article recently. It's actually a book chapter and it's not on PubMed. So I'd be happy to circulate that if you'd like, because that gives a real kind of overview of all this.
That would, yes. I'll take the link from you later, so that I can put it below and leave it here.
Perfect.
That's great, perfect. Susan. Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure, and to talk to you, to chat to you, and to just sort of like talk about these subjects that we like to talk about.
Absolutely. No, I've loved it. I hope we get to speak again soon, either Zoom or in person, whatever the world decides. Yeah,
well, we have actually got to be in person together. I look forward to seeing you at a TOS meeting one day, if they are ever again kind of, in person.
Yes, fingers crossed. And, thank you for spreading the word about the appetitive traits, and thank you for the ABQ. We're kind of administering that all over the place now. So
good.
Excited to see what turns out from that research.
Yeah, we're trying to do a lot of stuff as well. So hopefully we'll get, more and more information about the traits in that stage of the life course. Thank you so much again, Susan. And I'm going to say what I say to every single time that we connect. We continue to nourish each other. And please share this podcast with, anybody who you think might find this interesting. And thank you for showing up again today. Bye-bye.
Nos vemos en un próximo episodio de Alimentos y Emociones Podcast. Y recuerda, nos seguimos nutriendo.